Hello and welcome to this reclass of Session 4 at, in the Computers and Technology 6 course. In this session we're going to cover what we covered in class, Introduction to Playmaker inside of Unity, and using it to program some simple functionality. If you are from my class, welcome. I hope you can see things here that you missed or didn't quite understand in class. If you're not from my class, then I hope this contains what you were searching for. My PowerPoint is acting up, so I'm just going to go through this manually, which shouldn't be a big deal because it's only 2 slides. What we're going to cover again in this course, or in this session of the course, is look at a breakdown of the translate function / method. So some people call it a function, some people call it a method. Of the transform class, which comes inside of Unity standard. It contains a lot of functions you'll find useful at some point. We're going to see how to do a simple movement script inside of C#. But the transform class, its translate method. We'll take a look at how to do a debug log for checking input and doing simple movement inside of Playmaker, and we'll obviously see an introduction of the Playmaker interface. Alright, so first we'll switch over here to Unity, and you'll see that all I have is a simple cube. There is no added functionality at this time over here. It's just a default cube. To prove that, I'll just delete the cube, and I'll add another cube. See that there's nothing special about this cube. Alright, so this cube, I'm going to attach a simple script, which is inside of this basic movement folder. And if we take a look at this script, it's very simple. Inside of the update function or method, we do a search or a check for the horizontal axis. If it returns a float greater than 0, we translate an object 1 in the x-axis. Same thing for -0. Only we transform or we translate it -1 in the x-axis. If vertical returns greater than 0, sorry, there's my alarm. If vertical is greater than 0, it returns, or it translates 1 in the z-axis, and if vertical is less than 0, then it translates -1 in the z-axis. So, what is all this transform translate? Well, let's take a look. The transform function, class. It has a lot of different functions and variables inside of it, but what it does is it controls the position, rotation, and scale of an object. Every object in a scene has a transform. So what does that mean? Well, any object that you create always has this transform component. It always has the transform class, and this is to identify where in the scene is located. Even if we create an empty game object with nothing else inside of it, it still will have a transform component. Alright, so that's what that is saying. Alright, so every transform can have a parent, which allows you to apply position, rotation, and scale hierarchically. Is that how you pronounce that? Hierarchically? Alright, well, this is the hierarchy seen in the hierarchy pane. So what does that say? Well, it's telling us that let's say I make a sphere. Alright, I have this little sphere. Alright, and I want this sphere to follow the cube. Well, I'll just leave that there for now, but what it really means is I can make the cube a parent of the sphere. See? If I attach the move script, hit play, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but you can see that the sphere will now follow the cube. Alright, so that's what that is saying. Alright, so the function, the public function that we're going to use, and there are a lot of here that you might find useful. Get child to find out the child of something. Is child of Boolean check. You can do rotate, look at something, so that whenever something else moves, it will always rotate and face that something. Very useful for camera functions. And this is the one we're going to use. It's translate. Moves the transform in the direction and distance of translation. Now, you got to keep in mind that this function or this method is usually used for things like moving platforms and stuff like that. If you don't actually use the animation, you make an animation with it. Typically, you don't use this to control player movement. There's reasons for that, which we'll explore later. At this time, we're just getting an introduction to this function, so it's okay to go ahead and use it. We go into the translate function. We see that it takes in 2 parameters. It takes in a vector 3, and the parameter is called translation. It also takes in a space, and the parameter is relative to. Typically, you'll find this to be either space.self or space.world. So what are these things? Well, it moves the transform, so it moves the object, or it moves the object that the transform is connected to, in the direction and distance of a translation. So translation is a vector 3, which means it's simply a coordinate type setup where you have an X, Y, and Z. Keep in mind that these are not points, but these are vectors. If relative to is left out, which means this is optional, or is set to space.self, the movement is applied relative to the transform's local axis, the X, Y, and Z of the object. So if I click this, we can see that the Z direction up here at the view cube, the Z direction is pointing up, or this way, and the x-axis is going this way, and the y-axis is going straight up vertically. The Z is the depth. Now, if I move this, excuse me, in relation to the world, it would always move this way. Okay. Same thing if I actually rotate it, and I wanted to move it again in the z-axis. It would be moving this way because that's north as far as the world is concerned. But if I move it in space relative to itself, north is this way. So this is which way is up, dependent on where you are. So that's space.self. Space.world is always the same, it never changes, and it's dependent on the way the world is set up. Alright, so that explains that a little bit. So essentially what it means is inside of this check, we do a check for horizontal if someone is pressing the right key or the D key, we grab the transform that's on the game object that this is the script will be attached to. That's what this means. When you have game object with a lowercase g, it's talking about whichever game object that this script is attached to. Then it says dot transform. So that's the transform component. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. That's the transform component that is attached to the game object that this script is attached to. So we call the translate function of that transform, and the arguments that we send it are 1 in the x, or 1 for an x vector, 0 for a y vector, and 0 for a z vector. So move right. Over here we see move left. Here we see move up, or not up, but move 1 in the z-axis. I don't want to say up and confuse you as far as going up vertically. Alright, but this is essentially what this does, is go forward, just depending on what forward is to the object. Alright, and -1 means go backward. Okay, so go to Unity and hit play. It's hard to see, so let's go ahead and add a directional light. And if I press up, it goes up, down, goes down, left goes left, right, or it goes right. You know how it goes. Now, this is very fast. So what you can do is, instead of just multiplying it like this, you can say, okay, move this far. What you can do one of two things. You can, let's say we want to slow it down by half. You can do this. Now the F indicates that this is a float. By default, if you use a number with a floating point decimal, it will default to a double, and it just essentially means that it can hold more space. But we don't need doubles for right now. It's used for higher accuracy, but we're not going to use it, so don't worry about it. All right, so add another float here and one final float. Oh, not that. All right. So instead of moving 1 in the x-axis, or -1 in the x-axis, we're just going to move 0.5. Alright, so what did I mess up? Let's see. Oh. Yeah, that's what happens when you don't put the F. You get an error. Alright, so now when I hit play, it's slower. It might not look like it's slower, but it is slower. Alright, a better option, let's undo all of that. You got to keep in mind that vectors are numbers. And when we say translate, we're saying translate according to a number. So what we can do inside of here, instead of doing this, first of all, if you want to do testing, if you want to be able to do some dynamic testing before you decide on the movement speed, you can create a public variable up here and say we're going to create a public float speed. We're going to initialize it to be 5. And that's it. Now, what does that do? Well, that makes this variable, speed, show up over here under that script. So you can see here the move script now has a public variable called speed, and we can change this. Alright. It defaults to 5, but while the game is playing, or we can override it, or we can actually override it before. But so this is what we're going to do. We're going to translate not by a static, well no, it is actually still static, but we're going to say a new vector3. Alright. Now this will do the same thing as the previous iteration of this. Whoa, no. Let's just do it manually. No, that takes too long. So alright, so this will do exactly the same thing as it did before to prove that. And it does exactly the same thing. But what we've done is now we can say a new vector3 times speed times speed. So we've made this to where we can actually do some math on it. Yeah, it's going to drive me crazy, so I need to space that out. Alright, so now we can save this and press play, and now it goes super fast, but I can take the speed down until I get it to something more manageable. So okay, that seems okay. 0.22. Alright, so now go over here and change this to 0.22. Now by default, well, it should have been by default. What did I do? I didn't save it. Oh, that's right. You got to add it again. Alright, so we'll take that off and we'll re-add the move script. Just a little quirk. Alright, so now it changes. Okay, so simple movement script using the translate function. Now, so far in this course, we've covered just a little bit of information. How to use input.getAccess, how to use now the transform.translate function, or the translate function of the transform class. And we've covered how to use the log function from the debug class. And it's taken quite a bit of script and quite a bit of frustration if you are unfamiliar with code blocks and terminators and all these things, all these syntactual things we've went over. So what I'm going to show you, or what I've already shown you, is a tool called Playmaker that works inside of Unity. And it is essentially, if you remember last year when we used Raptor, which was flowcharts to do programming, it's essentially the same kind of concepts. You create what's known as a finite state machine on an object, and it works just like a script. The script, or the finite state machine, or FSM, will use any information that's contained on the object that it's actually attached to, which you can have many finite state machines inside of a scene. You can make prefabs, which we haven't went over yet, but you can make prefabs out of the finite state machines. And a finite state machine is essentially something that is running all the time. It has different states, so you can think of a light switch. The state of the light switch is off, no light happens. As soon as you touch the switch, the switch returns true, I guess, and the light comes on. And the finite state machines work like that. You can think of a conditional that only checks a couple things. You can think of it that way. But you can have a conditional that checks a lot of things as well. You can have one that doesn't check anything, but it will move to a new state whenever something is true. It'll always do this check. And of course you can control what that check is, but you make it move from state to state to state. You can think of an enemy character in a game, for example the Metal Gear series. You have the enemies that are in their state, patrol state. So they're just walking around, smoking or whatever they do, until they see you. And then they go into their searching kind of state. Okay, so they have different functionality for their searching state. Whenever they see you and have confirm that you are a hostile character, I guess, they go into their attacking state. Alright, if you run away and they can't see you anymore after a certain amount of time, they return to their patrolling state with a heightened awareness, or a heightened, not really awareness, I guess, just they're more alert, we'll put it that way. Alright, so to do this, we're going to import an asset. Alright, so I actually had to re-import, so I went back in time as far as this video is concerned. So you just saw a flash where one thing was happening and then something else happened. So go up to assets, assets, import package, custom package, and we'll import the Playmaker package. We're going to import everything. Alright, so what this has done is it adds a new drop-down menu for us. Editor windows, components, tools, lots of stuff here. You're welcome to check any of these out. We'll get through some of them. The most important ones are the Playmaker editor, which we will open, and the action browser, which we will open. Alright, so the thing to keep in mind here before we even start is the FSM that you're going to be altering or creating is the FSM that's located on the object that you have selected. Now, if it says select the game object in your window here, and you're like, oh, I can't get any actions, nothing's working, or my action browser isn't appearing down here. Well, there's a reason. You don't have a game object selected. I can't right click and make an FSM. Well, there's a reason. You don't have a game object selected. My life is terrible, please help me. Well, there's a reason. You don't have a game object selected. Alright, so we're going to select the game object that we're going to be working with, the cube, and we're going to create an FSM. Now to do this, and remember FSM is finite state machine. To do this, right click to add an FSM. Right click, add FSM. Alright, so you have all these shortcuts things that come up the first time that you open Playmaker. Over here is where you rename whatever state you're in. I like to name my first state as a listener, but this is just entirely a little thing that I like to do because it's listening for something. Completely optional. You do not have to do that. You can leave it to whatever you want. It's whatever makes the most sense to you. Okay. So we have the state, which you're editing whatever states you have. FSM has a lot of different, you can set up your description, listens for input or whatever. Events, we'll get to those later. This is actually whenever you actually want to change states, you'll be using the event tab. And variables, so if you want to create some variables or some fields, which would be the terminology for classes, you go over to variables. Now the action browser, this is essentially where you can grab a lot of different functionality that's included inside of Unity and inside of Playmaker, but you can also download custom scripts that people have made to do other functionality, or you can even add your own in there. Of course, that's beyond the scope of this beginner's course, but just to let you know. The GUI ones, we may be making use of those, but I don't think so. Maybe, maybe not, because looks like they incorporate the old GUI system. But I'm sure they have, here we go, GUI layout. Okay, yeah, we'll be using this one in GUI element. There was an old GUI system. If you don't know what GUIs are, it's graphical user interface, health bars, menu systems, things like of that nature. But it really sucked. I mean, it enabled you to design your GUI through code, which some people like that. It's okay, but the new GUI system is a what you see, what you get kind of system. So it's drag visual elements in, mix them together, set up the code pretty easily to actually make your GUIs much more user-friendly. Sometimes I'll still use the code for the different GUI sections, but the thing I like about the new way is you don't have to keep pressing play to see what your GUI looks like. You know what it's going to look like every time. You always know where your anchors are going to be, etc., etc. Alright, so all of that doesn't matter for this lesson, so let's move on. Alright, so the three functions that I mentioned, and to get all this stuff to pop off, just press F1. If you press F1 again, it will come back. Okay, so the three functions we've used so far are debug.log, the translate function of the transform class, and the get access function from the input class. So as customary, we will grab a debug log. So I start to type in the name of that function I've used, or the name of that class and function that I've used, and here we go, we have a debug log. Well, what does that do? So double click that, it adds that action to this state. So all of this stuff in this state is going to run anytime that we get to this state. Now, I'll show you what I mean. If I press play, you can see that this the FSM on this game object is currently at listener. Okay. Now, if you have other states, for example, I go over here, I add another state. I say whenever this is finished, to go to this state, and I can do whatever over here. When the FSM is running, it will highlight in green which state it's in. So the only thing this did was debug log, and then it's finished, so it goes to the next state. Now, if I were to say create an event, and this is kind of like making your own little function, more or less, and we'll call it my event. That does absolutely nothing. And we'll change this transition event to my event. Now when we press play, it won't switch automatically. Alright, it will stay here because nothing has told my event to run. So state 1 will never get called. Alright, so that's just to explain a little bit of that functionality, which we haven't gotten to yet. Alright, so we will delete that. I'm not trying to delete the state, I'm trying to delete the event. Alright, so we will delete the transition. Alright, so if we debug log, for some reason when I switch it to info, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So we'll do a hello world. And you can see here it doesn't actually show up. I don't know why. I'm not going to pretend I do. But what I do know is that if you switch it to warning or error, it will show up. Alright, so here we can see that a warning debug has come up as hello world. Conversely, if we change it from from warning to error, it will come up as red. Very bad. Alright, so that's how you do a debug log inside of Playmaker. Obviously, especially for beginners, a little easier than scripting. Alright, so let's take a look at our other methods we've done in class. Let's remove this action. And let's open our action browser, which again, this is kind of like looking at the functions. And we'll look at first we do a get access. Now, if you'll remember, a get access returns a float value. Now, we want to actually be able to store that float value. Reason being, and I'll show you, because I'm going to add I'm going to add another get access actually. Alright. And then we're going to do a translate. Alright, so what does the translate want? Well, translate wants us to tell us, okay, the game object, so the owner is whichever one it's attached to, this FSM. Which vector are we going to move it in? Now, this will get the axis, but we need to store it somewhere so that we can tell this translate function what exactly we're trying to, which direction we're trying to translate. So here we say, okay, first axis I want you to get horizontal. Second axis I want you to get vertical. Okay, where do you want to store them? Well, we don't have any variables or fields set up right now, so we go over to variables. We know that the get access function returns a float, so that's how we will actually make, or the type of variable we will make. There are a lot of different ones you can use, but we'll make one called vert for vertical, and one called horiz, and that will be our horizontal. Alright, so we can say the horizontal, whenever you get the float back from this function, store that value inside of this field. Whenever you get the float value for get axis vertical, store it in this field. And we're going to move, so translate, the X vector to use is the horizontal one, and the Z is the vertical one. Space is self. We want to do it per second and every frame, so this essentially puts it inside of the update methods. And I must have accidentally deleted that. Alright, so now if I hit play, of movement. Exactly the same as all of that complicated, not complicated to me, but for beginners it looks a little bit overwhelming. Same code, no problem, but we do it with a simple flowchart which only has one state so far, rather than a bunch of code. Alright, so for the ones that are actually planning on studying some kind of design course or career, or computer science or computer engineering, I would recommend that you continue to use code to get used to it. You'll be seeing it a lot. But if you want to use Playmaker, you're more than welcome to. I'm not going to emphasize the importance of learning syntax, because the importance of learning workflows and how to make objects communicate with each other and why you do that, and creating variables to store information, things of that nature, is actually more important than syntax. But if you want to keep coding, go right ahead. For everyone else, this is a tool that's available to you for your projects. This is the one we're using in class to speed things along for demonstration purposes. I guess that's it. So in this presentation we have covered all of this. We've broken down what the translate function does. We've made a simple movement script in C#, or at least demonstrated one. We've done a debug log. We've checked for input and done simple movement inside of Playmaker, and we've done an introduction to the Playmaker interface. Introduction is pretty much encompassing two windows so far: the Playmaker editor window and the action browser. Now remember that the action browser button will not show up if you don't have something selected. They say, oh no, it's not there. Well, if you select an object, then the action browser will show up. So then you can choose which action you actually want to choose for this state. Alright, so keep in mind that all of the states that you add will run whenever this state is the one that's chosen in the state machine. Alright, so that's it. This is the ReClass for Introduction to Playmaker Session 4. I hope you got some useful information out of this. My name is Christopher Dillard, and I'll see you next time.